For a very long time, the empath existed through outward motion. Their instinct was to sense others before they could sense themselves. Emotional energy flowed continuously outward, to soothe tension, to keep the atmosphere from shattering, to preserve connection even at the cost of inner contraction. They learned to listen more than speak, to endure more than demand, to yield more than question. Their love did not arise from free choice, but from the fear of loss, losing people, losing connection, losing the feeling of being needed. In the language of Sigmund Freud, this is an ego formed and sustained by unconscious dependence. Libido, the energy of life and love, is invested outward as a survival strategy. If I understand enough, if I am good enough, if I am patient enough, I will not be abandoned. The empath does not love because they are abundant. They love to secure their own psychological existence. And so they often live in a state of latent tension, constantly monitoring others' reactions, constantly adjusting themselves to keep the thread of connection from breaking. Then a very different moment arrives. Not loud, not dramatic, no emotional climax. A moment so quiet that almost no one around notices at first, not even the empath themselves. They stop waiting for a signal. They stop reacting to familiar behaviors. They stop explaining, stop justifying, stop trying to make themselves understood. Not because they have become cold or hardened, but because an inner withdrawal has occurred. Energy no longer continues to flow outward in search of an anchor. Libido stops seeking an object to cling to, stops orbiting others as the center of meaning. It returns to the self not as an act of defiance, but as a natural psychological reflex when an old strategy has lost its efficacy. The empath begins to stay with themselves, not through determination, but through the absence of need. And it is precisely at this point that the old structure begins to collapse. When there is no surplus emotion left to extract, manipulative mechanisms lose their ground. When there is no reaction to trigger, controlling power becomes hollow. When there is no inner void left to fill, every promise, threat, or emotional script becomes meaningless. The empath does nothing, yet the world around them is forced to change, because it once operated on their unconscious participation. Freud would not call this state healing in the usual sense. He would call it dangerous. Because a person who no longer needs to be loved in order to exist is a person no longer governed by the fear of loss, no longer dependent on external validation, and no longer contained within any system of emotional control. This is the final stage of the empath, not the end of the journey, but the beginning of an entirely different inner life. Part 1. The empath's unconscious structure before becoming dangerous. Before the empath enters this final stage, they are not weak in the way people often assume. On the contrary, they possess a highly refined psychological structure, one built around adaptation rather than sovereignty. From Freud's perspective, the empath's ego learns an early survival lesson. Safety comes from attachment. From a very young age, they recognize that harmony matters more than truth, that other people's emotions must be prioritized over their own needs. Thus, the ego is formed not through assertion, but through constant adjustment. The empath grows up with an ego that is always listening outward. They observe tone of voice, eye contact, silences, subtle shifts in others' emotions, not out of curiosity, but because unconsciously they believe that if they can read the external world well enough, they will not be abandoned. This is not a conscious choice, it is an early defense mechanism. In Freud's model, the empath's libido is not firmly anchored in the ego. It flows powerfully outward, invested in others, in relationships, in the role of the understanding one, the healer, the peacekeeper. Love, in this case, is no longer simply an emotion, it becomes a survival strategy. As a result, the empath often loves very deeply, but not entirely freely. They love with a quiet anxiety. If I am not understanding enough, if I set boundaries, if I stop, will I still be kept? Love becomes entangled with the fear of losing connection, making it easy to confuse attachment with dependence. Freud would describe this as a form of excessive object investment. The ego places too much of its sense of existence into others' reactions. When the object is pleased, the empath feels safe. When the object turns cold, the ego immediately destabilizes. And so the empath learns to self-regulate, reducing needs, suppressing anger, swallowing hurt, rationalizing the other's behavior just to keep the relationship from collapsing. What matters is this: the empath is not blind. They often see distortions, contradictions, warning signs very clearly, but their ego has grown accustomed to sacrificing truth to preserve connection. Freud would say that at this stage, the empath does not lack awareness, they lack self-priority. This structure makes the empath especially susceptible to manipulative relationships, not because they are naive, but because they carry an unconscious belief that love must be paid for. And as long as that belief persists, the empath remains, however, passively within an unequal system. But every structure has its limit of endurance, and when that limit is reached, the entire system is forced to shift. That is where the dangerous phase begins to take shape. Part 2. When Freud names the exploited mechanism, the empath and the narcissistic bond. To understand why the empath enters the dangerous phase, we must first look directly at the relational structure that bound them for so long. According to Sigmund Freud, asymmetrical relationships do not form by chance. They are sustained by the meeting of two opposing yet complementary unconscious needs. On one side is the empath, an ego that learns to survive through adjustment, through emotional investment, through becoming a refuge for others. On the other side is the narcissist, an inflated ego that is hollow within, requiring constant mirroring, validation, and nourishment from the outside. Freud would call this an object-dependent relationship. One gives in order to feel safe, the other takes in order to feel that they exist. The empath is not drawn to the narcissist's power. They are drawn to the void, a void that activates a familiar reflex. If I stay long enough, if I love correctly enough, everything will be okay. The narcissist, in turn, is drawn to the empath because there they find a steady, abundant emotional energy, flexible, responsive, and available, a supply that does not require facing the self. In Freudian terms, this is unconscious collusion, not conspiracy, not intention, but two psychological structures fitting together like interlocking pieces. One needs to be needed, the other needs someone to draw from. And as long as the empath believes that love must be paid for with endurance, this loop continues. The crucial point is this: empaths often see the distortions very clearly. They sense the manipulation, the inconsistency, the emptiness behind the charming surface. But their ego is accustomed to postponing truth in order to preserve connection. Freud would call this a subtle form of denial, not knowing, but knowing, and not yet permitting oneself to act on what is known. This postponement is precisely what allows the narcissist to escalate, because for the narcissist, every time the empath explains on their behalf, every time the empath yields, every time the empath stays despite being hurt, power is reinforced. No violence is needed. No coercion is required. As long as the empath continues to invest libido outward, the system runs on its own. But Freud emphasized that every dependent system carries within it the seed of collapse. When one side gives too much, the ego begins to deplete. When investment no longer produces even a minimal sense of safety, the ego is forced to seek another exit, not through immediate rebellion, but through a quiet withdrawal. And this is the pivotal moment. Not when the empath realizes they are being used, they have known this for a long time, but when they no longer have enough energy to continue denying it. It is here that the once stable bond begins to fracture, not because of arguments, not because of drama, but because the energy that sustained it is slowly being withdrawn. The empath is not yet dangerous at this stage, but they have begun to become difficult to control. And once unconscious dependency is destabilized, the entire system must soon face the inevitable, a reversal of power. Part 3. The breaking point. When defense mechanisms can no longer save the ego. Every unconscious structure has a limit of endurance. For the empath, that limit is not defined by the amount of pain endured, but by the capacity to continue deceiving oneself in order to preserve connection. According to Sigmund Freud, the ego can tolerate pain for a very long time if that pain still serves a survival function. But when pain no longer yields even minimal safety, defense mechanisms begin to crack. The breaking moment rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. More often, it is the slow accumulation of irreconcilable contradictions, words that do not match actions, conditional care, injuries dismissed as oversensitivity. The empath has seen it all. They simply have not yet allowed themselves to fully believe what they have seen. Freud described this state as repression overload. As long as repression functions, the ego can continue to rationalize, justify, and endure. But at a certain point, the energy required to maintain denial exceeds the energy left to live. And then the truth previously held at the edge of awareness floods the center. What must be understood is this: the empath is not shocked by discovering the truth. They are shaken by realizing that they have known it for a long time, yet chose silence to preserve a structure that was harming them. The rupture does not lie in the external object, but in an old belief about love, the belief that if one is patient enough, understanding enough, self-sacrificing enough, everything will be okay. When that belief collapses, the ego falls into a strange void, not chaos, but lucid emptiness. The empath no longer reacts as before. They do not argue, plead, or try to prove anything. Freud would say that here, the ego has temporarily suspended familiar reflexes because they no longer serve survival. For the person on the other side, this change is often disorienting. They are accustomed to an empath who always responds, explains, and holds things together. When that response disappears, they sense something deeply unsettling. The anchor has loosened. But for the empath, this is not yet liberation. It is an intermediate phase where the ego is attempting to reorganize. Freud called this stage a necessary ego crisis. Without it, psychological maturation is impossible. The ego must accept the loss of a familiar structure, even one that caused pain, in order to make room for another, less dependent structure. The empath begins to withdraw, not to punish anyone, but because they no longer have the energy to continue playing the old role. And it is precisely in this quiet space that something crucial happens. For the first time, the empath no longer organizes their emotional life around another person. Not full sovereignty yet, but a departure from the old center. This is the thin boundary between two worlds, where the old ego is slowly dying, and the new ego has not yet formed. Most outsiders will call this coldness, change, or sudden distance. Freud would name it more accurately, the termination of an outdated survival mechanism. And when that mechanism no longer functions, the next phase is inevitable. The complete withdrawal of energy, where the empath truly enters the territory Freud would call dangerous. Part 4. The dangerous phase. When libido withdraws back to the ego. This phase does not begin with action, but with a complete inner withdrawal. According to Sigmund Freud, when libido ceases to be invested in external objects and returns to the ego, the power structure of all dependent relationships loses its foundation. This is not escape, nor is it resistance. It is a reallocation of life energy. In the previous phase, the empath merely stopped reacting. In this phase, they no longer feel the need to react. The difference is subtle, yet decisive. Not because they have become numb, but because the ego has regained its internal axis. They no longer organize their emotional life around what others think, need, or how they might respond. Attention, once constantly pulled outward, now rests quietly within. Freud called this phenomenon the withdrawal of object investment. When investment is withdrawn, familiar manipulative tactics immediately lose their effect. There is no emotion left to trigger, no fear of abandonment to threaten, no hope of being understood to entice. The empath does not need to fight anything. The system collapses on its own for lack of sustaining energy. What makes this state labeled dangerous is this. The empath can no longer be controlled by the unconscious mechanisms that once worked so effectively. Their silence is not strategic. It is the natural consequence of an ego that no longer depends. They do not explain because explanation no longer feels necessary. They do not negotiate because boundaries are no longer something to be argued into existence. They do not seek closure because the ego has already completed its own internal loop. For the one who once held control, this is a moment of panic. All prior power rested on a single assumption, that the empath needed them for emotional stability. When that assumption collapses, there is no longer any leverage for manipulation. But for the empath, this state is not loud. It carries the quality of deep calm, a calm that emerges only when the ego no longer has to protect itself through self-sacrifice. Freud would say that here, the ego has reached a level of autonomy. Not autonomy through outward strength, but autonomy because it is no longer governed by lack. When the empath no longer needs to be loved in order to exist, they do not need to win, to be right, or to be recognized. They need only remain faithful to their inner truth. It is this fidelity that makes them dangerous to any system built on the extraction of emotion. Because you cannot manipulate a person who no longer has an inner void to fill. You cannot control a person who no longer fears loss. And you cannot bargain with a person who has withdrawn their energy from the game. This is not the end of the empath's journey, but it is the point of no return. From the moment libido has withdrawn back to the ego, every step that follows belongs to sovereignty. Part 5. Why the empath's calm is what the narcissist fears most. At this stage, what causes the old system to collapse is not the empath's actions, but their psychological absence. According to Sigmund Freud, every manipulative structure requires a foundational condition. Libido must be invested in the object. When there is no investment, power has nowhere to anchor. The narcissist does not fear anger. They are accustomed to anger. Anger is still a form of attachment. It proves that the other still cares, is still reactive, still exists within their emotional field. What the narcissist truly cannot contend with is unhidden calm, the state in which the empath no longer seeks a response, nor tries to provoke one. When the empath is in the dangerous phase, they do not need to win an argument, because they are no longer participating in the game. They do not need to be acknowledged as right, because right and wrong are no longer the foundation of their values. Freud would call this the moment when object relations are nullified. The object still exists in reality, but no longer occupies a central place in the psychic life. For the narcissist, this is a rupture with survival-level implications. Their entire ego structure requires constant mirroring to sustain a sense of existence. When the empath no longer mirrors, no pain, no anger, no pleading, no proving, the narcissist faces a void. They lack the capacity to self-regulate. They call it coldness. Freud would name it more precisely, the loss of the ego's sustaining object. What is notable is that the empath is not intentionally punishing. They do not use silence as a tactic. Silence appears because there is nothing left inside that needs to be said in order to preserve connection. This is the core difference. Punishment still involves attachment. Calm does not. For this reason, every attempt to pull them back becomes meaningless. Whether through apologies, promises, blame, or playing the victim, everything slides past the empath without generating emotional friction. Freud would say, when libido has withdrawn back to the ego, no manipulative language can take effect, because there is no longer an unconscious need to strike. At this point, the balance of power has completely reversed, but no one has seized power. The old power dissolves on its own because it is no longer being fed. The empath does not rise to dominate. They simply no longer occupy the position of the dominated. And that is why the empath's calm is called dangerous. Not because they cause harm, but because they end the conditions that allow harm to exist. From here on, the relationship, whether it continues or ends, can no longer carry its old structure. Because once the empath has withdrawn energy from the system, what was once called power is nothing more than a memory. The final stage of the empath is not the moment they become hardened, nor the moment they learn to be strong in the common sense of the word. According to Sigmund Freud, it is the moment when the ego stops seeking reassurance from the outside, stops investing energy in objects that once determined their emotions and sense of worth. No more asking to be loved, no more proving, no more fear of loss. The empath returns to their own inner axis. It is this return that causes them to be called dangerous. Not because they harm anyone, but because they can no longer be controlled through emotional lack. A person who does not need to be loved in order to exist is a person no longer bound by the fear of abandonment. And when that fear disappears, every system that once operated through manipulation, control, or emotional bargaining collapses on its own. At this stage, the empath does not defeat anyone. They do not need to be right. They simply withdraw from structures that required them to sacrifice themselves in order to preserve connection. Their silence is not a weapon, but the sign of a completed ego, an ego that no longer needs reaction to affirm its existence. Freud would not call this the end of healing, but psychological maturation. When libido has withdrawn back to the ego, the empath steps out of the cycle of unconscious repetition. They no longer play any role in the old scripts. And from that point on, every relationship in their life can exist only on a new foundation: freedom, boundaries, and truth. That is why this stage is called dangerous. Not dangerous to the innocent, but dangerous to any system that once survived by requiring you to forget yourself.